last few years, one of the things that we have realized is the monolithic architecture that we were building in all our devices was great at some point of time. But with the changing times, when you are seeing that the technology teams are spread across the world, uh, and your expertise is also spread across the world. We are talking about today's world where open innovation is becoming a norm of the day. You are no more talking about all things that happen in this company are in the four walls of this company. And if you need to integrate all these solutions into a measurable, meaningful outcome for the patient or a doctor, you need to create the platform that's going to take all these inputs. If you don't have those possibilities of having those APIs that they take it and create that outcome for the patients, it's going to be a challenge. Is it the case only with healthcare? No. In fact, healthcare is probably the slowest to do this because we are governed by FDA, we are governed by a lot of regulations. Whereas there are many other companies, many other domains where this has taken a lot more deeper root. Social platforms have really used this to the biggest extent because that was the only way you could really bring in the expertise across. Now, today we have three great panelists. What I like about this panel is we have a mix of what I call it as youth and experience. We have two people, who are just about 3 or 4 years into their journey into a new company and how they looked at this. And we have Paddy, whose company has been in it for quite a long time. And they have been doing it from monolithic to new way of doing things. But they have seen it and they had to transform themselves. I think to them, the challenge has been probably a large workforce running in thousands of engineers and people, it is all probably the generation of my kind who stuck with the company and they all were loyal to the company and stuck. Sometimes what happens, people like us who are stuck to a particular technology, we always believe that is the best way and we don't want to change. And that's where I think I want to start this first with the question to Paddy is you come from a company which has great domain expertise. You have tremendous, outcome you have shown in the market so far. And what really transpired in the company to move over to microservices architecture? And what has been the journey so far? How has it happened? Typically, I'm really interested in looking at how you looked at it from your organizational point of view, because many times organizational structures define how your outcome is going to be. You subtly influence thinking in the minds of people, how the communication structure is there in the organization is the similar way the technology gets developed. So what has been the driving factor towards microservices?
No, thanks, Dileep. It's a very intense topic, and to have this topic after lunch, if I were sitting the other side, I would be dozing off. So we have been seeing this journey over the last 4 to 5 years, right? And it's a combination of several factors. It's just not microservices. Microservices, containers, DevOps, agile, automation, cloud, etc., etc., etc. Right? It's a combination of all this. This has in fact reinvigorated the whole engineering, job market again, where people are now coming back with newer skills into the market. There are two key things that I want to touch upon in the initial flow, and we'll discuss the rest, as we go on. One is that microservices cannot be implemented for the sake of technology, right? It has to be business driven, and I'll give an example. When we started our careers, we used to have what is called as ER diagram. I don't know how many of you have seen even a concept of ER diagram. We used to sit on a board, design the entire enterprise, draw tables, nouns. My boss used to say, go find the actor, actress, draw a use case, and then build some hundreds of pages of design documents, sequence diagram, class diagram, etc., etc., and then implement it over 3 years, only to find out that the business has moved on, right? And the system we've implemented is no longer relevant. That was still the case with us, right, and our customers, until customers, competition like Tesla and Amazon and Netflix and the Googles of the world came over, and they started teaching us a lesson saying, guys, if you don't release your updates every day, if you don't make product refreshes every day, if not every hour, you're going to be out of the market, right? So they made us realize, and our businesses came back in and said, hey, our competition has released 30 features or 40 features or 50 features over the last 1 month, and you guys have been working on 2 features for the last 8 months, right? And you gave a big code saying I'll do impact analysis, regression testing, UAT. Why? Because our old architecture was so tightly coupled, right? The database was so tightly coupled, the middleware was so tightly coupled, the application layer was so tightly coupled that if somebody came to me and said, Paddy, can I have one drop-down change in the screen? I gave him a quote of 4 months, and said, what, this is going to cost you 200K, and more than happy to do it, right? And then eventually that fellow figured out to do it in Excel, right? He said, to hell with the system, I'll do it in the Excel. But when new age companies like Tesla, etc., came on board, they changed the paradigm. And the point I want to make is, unless your business comes back to you and says that I want to make things faster in the market, I want to get features faster in the market, I want to make changes faster in the market, I want to release upgrades every hour, every day, every week, I want to keep my customers locked in. Unless the business realizes the demand, any amount of technology push is not going to work. So going back to your question on what changed in the organization, it was really our sales, right? It was really our marketing folks, our customers marketing folks, our customer sales folks who came back in and said, this is not going anywhere. I can't sell this anymore. Platform is not selling anymore. So that's on the business side of things. On the technology side of things, I don't know about you all. I'm sure all of you have gone through all this yourself, and all of your geeks here. But I have seen people using microservices synonymously with DevOps, sometimes with containers, sometimes with Docker, sometimes with Kubernetes, sometimes with services. So a lot of the synonymization of microservices is happening, when in the lingo, right? When you speak to technologists and business folks alike. But in reality, it's actually a design concept, right? How do you reimagine your enterprise? Going back to Dileep, your question, how do you look at enterprise as an event-based enterprise and not a noun-based enterprise? And there's a vast difference in how you look at the enterprise itself. When you look at an enterprise as nouns, right? Purchase orders and, customer master and, order master and masters, right? These are the, this is the jargon that we take out from ERP. It's a very static view of the enterprise, and that's what actually holds you back from making changes to your platform and application. But when you look at enterprise as events, as verbs, as workflows that happen in the enterprise, and by the way, Conway coined this philosophy like decades back, saying enterprise is a reflection of various events that happen in the enterprise, and he wanted the IT systems to reflect that. But the technologies were not supporting back then. So when you look at enterprise as a series of events and domain and not as noun, then you are actually looking at redesigning the whole enterprise itself, right? And not just adding services on top of that. That is when you do a remodeling of the enterprise. And we have two types of programs that we get access to. Greenfield programs like, TapChief or Meesho, ground up platforms, a lot more easier to envisage a newer enterprise, implement newer technology, newer systems. But when you get into brownfield, like when you talk to retailers who have 80 applications, 100 applications, and they throw it at us and say, make it microservices, we know two things. One is we know we've got a huge customer who's going to pay our bills for the next 4 years, right? And the second thing is that, that journey is just going to go nowhere because it's too complex for us to reimagine the whole enterprise itself. So the point I'm making is that when you imagine the design concept of microservices, you look at the enterprise or the product or the platform as a series of processes and how each and one of those processes become autonomous services and how those autonomous services can in turn become containerized, service rendering, right? And the last thing, of course, is, what we have seen is most of them containerize a monolith and call it a microservice. So the point is they take up a huge jar or EAR file, put it in a Docker, and then say, here is a microservice that I have released into the market. But in essence, if you are a true blue microservices company, you will have hundreds and hundreds of delivery pipelines, right? Your DevOps pipeline will be so humongous that you'll find it difficult to manage the pipeline from a release standpoint. So that again goes back to how you look at the enterprise itself from a design standpoint. So 3 points. One is your business must urge you to change. It's not a technology change. We have tried as technologists pushing it into business. All of them slept in various meetings. But when they realized that their competition is catching up, they woke us up and said, hey guys, you have done nothing. So give me something that I can make a release in the market. Second is reimagine your design from a event standpoint and not a static noun standpoint. And third, of course, is go the whole hog. If you want to do microservices, just don't containerize a monolith in a Docker container and call it a microservice. It's not a microservice. If it's a microservice, then each and every event has to be packaged its own database. Technically speaking, it has to network, it has to talk, and it has to also be secure. So that's largely the learning that we have seen from our customers from our internal landscape, Dileep.
Paddy, great insights into this. I think you mentioned for greenfield or startups or something, it may be slightly easier. I'm going to really put both of them on spot. Was it really easier? Microservice becomes a lot more need of the hour when the systems are complex, right? When the complexity increases, microservices become, in fact, they show the true color of their effectiveness and how you are able to manage it. And for both of you, when you are starting as a startup, you don't know how complex your system is going to be. You don't even know how big you are going to be, and you don't even know if you are going to be looking at a success as a startup. You start with something. So, how did the decision to move towards an architecture that's microservice based really start in your company? Maybe I think once that is done, Meesho can, yeah.
Great. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me around. Great to be alongside all these folks. To give you a very quick introduction, I run a company called TapChief. What we do is effectively we're trying to enable an alternate workforce which does not want to have jobs anymore, right? Who want to take up short-term projects, gigs, etc., with different companies in order to face different kinds of challenging problems as well as work with multivariate teams. And on the businesses side, a lot has changed over the last decade or so, wherein today most businesses, the top priority is to go ahead and solve key business objectives. It doesn't matter if a full-time person is kind of solving that, if a consultant or independent freelancer or worker is solving that, right? So that's what we do. We've been around since 2016. Started out actually in my hostel room in this college called BITS Pilani. Currently based out of Bangalore, team of 50, and so on. Some quick stats: we've driven around $1 million in earnings to these professionals and growing pretty reasonably. Very quickly coming back to the question about microservices and when did we really need to imbibe that into our DNA. So it was for us, interestingly, as a startup, it's a function of trade-offs, right? And for us, it was a need of the hour because we were facing an entirely different challenge. So we're on the back end, we're on Python, Django, Postgres, and so on and so forth. On the front end, we're using Angular 7 and a bunch of other things, right? And what happened is the other interesting challenge was that as a startup, with, as you mentioned, with all the risks associated and maybe not so much credibility in the market and so on, uh, uh, given that it's a job seekers market more than an employer's market as it continues, it was actually a pretty big of a challenge to get really talented folks who, with that kind of experience, who wanted to come work for a startup, usually at a pay cut and so on, right? This led us to start using our own platform for our own, the kind of products we were building and so on and so forth, right? Wherein we had to figure out how do we engage these independent developers, remote developers across the country, some sitting out of Surat, some sitting out of Guwahati, and so on and so forth. Now, when this happened, so internally we had a very strong backend team with my CTO Arjun and co-founder and CTO Arjun doing a pretty phenomenal job there. But on the front end side, we lacked that know-how and expertise. And what that led to over a period of time was that since we had to have so many different kinds of developers working on our systems, A, and B, because we were also building quite a few complicated aspects, right? Where we are trying to solve everything in the life cycle from a business coming on board saying, I need XYZ done, all the way up to evaluating them, signing legal contracts, going through payments, etc. All of which are extremely different things in the larger scheme of things for us as a product. Now, when this happened, we realized that since we're using Angular and so on, the the payload and the bundles, etc., was so high that, despite various optimizations that we tried with lazy loading and a bunch of other things, it didn't really improve the experience. It was deterring the experience, given that it was a slightly complicated product. And when we went and spoke in the market with most people, so for us, the access is obviously other startups who have been around and so on and so forth. We realized that, again, nobody had kind of, not not too many people at least had faced this kind of a challenge, because traditionally we've had app-based marketplaces, we've had content platforms, we've had e-commerce sites, but we were a full-fledged collaboration communication tool plus a marketplace on top, and there were a bunch of things happening, right? uh, and it got to a point where we actually had to reach out to a few people in the US and Singapore and so on and so forth, and check with them on what are some of the things that they were doing with respect to their front ends. And that's what led to us kind of splitting things on the front end, because we realized that while the data had to be maintained obviously across the board from a user's perspective, irrespective of the flow they're going through, from our engineering perspective, we realized that it could be much simpler if you were running multiple servers, each for a specific purpose, something to do with payments and nothing to do with communication. Yeah. So splitting those things uh, was the need of the hour. So when we did that, it led to us creating different kinds of libraries. It led to us standardizing the way to do things, especially on the front end, because it can get really messy really quick, right? So that's what led to us imbibing a microservices architecture on the front end. We continue to be a monolith on the back end. Uh, we feel that so for an engineering team of 15, 20 people, it's too much of a task to kind of do it on both sides. And it's not the need of the hour today. So yeah, that's what's been for us.
Absolutely. That's a great point in terms of how do you mix. It's not that everywhere you need to be looking at microservice. If you have at the back end monolithic and front end microservice structure, it still works. So coming to you, Sanjeev, you have used not just your platform, but you have used all the social platforms to your best advantage. I think you are a great example of using what is available in the field today and how to effectively make that into a business model. So, how did you really look at connecting social platform with your platform and create this microservice based structure?
Yeah. Is it audible? Yeah, sure. So to set some context here, I'm co-founder and CTO at Meesho. So what is Meesho? Meesho is simply, it enables anyone and everyone in India to just set up their social store. So there are a lot of people in India who have now started selling on Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. Meesho just enables this. We are right now empowering about 500,000, mostly housewives, who have set up their shops with us, and then they are doing their business, growing their business with us, having a lot of social impact on the society. Most of these housewives started doing this for the first time with Meesho, which kind of gave them much better image in the society as a business owner rather than a housewife. So that's about Meesho. Just one more number here. We have grown about 20 times in the last 1 year. I'll tell you subsequently why this number is important and why this led to kind of us going from monolith to microservices. So I think starting with why should a startup choose monolith? I think it's a very simple reason. So in the beginning, it is very important uh, for your startup to kind of iterate very quickly, because you are kind of solving a new problem, right? In most of the cases, this is the first time that someone has ever tackled this problem. So you don't know what to build. So you go out, talk to your users, figure out what is the right solution for them. Uh, and frankly speaking, doing this in a microservice model is really hard. Why? Because in the beginning, you have a lot of constraints on resources, specifically on the financial side. You don't have a lot of developers. So we just started. So in fact, I built the whole thing from scratch in the beginning. But yes, so probably for the next 1.5 years, I was just kind of managing all of this with just 5 devs. So taking those overhead of kind of the deployments, managing different microservices, it becomes really difficult. So that is why it makes a lot of sense to kind of start with monolith. We did that, scaled it to certain level. As more developers started joining, probably around
20 to 30 people on the backend side, you start seeing a lot of problems. So I think if I recall correctly, there were two major problems that we were facing, which led to kind of us going back to drawing board and figuring out how should we solve this problem, what kind of re-architecture needs to be done. So the first one being our iteration pace was getting slowed down. Because as you add more developers to the same monolith, it's a very tightly coupled code, right? So you change one thing, there are a lot of other things which breaks. And frankly, you don't get a lot of time to write unit tests. I'm sure unit test is a solution to this, but again, the same reasons you don't have a lot of resources. So you need to, and obviously when you hire a new developer, ramping him up and making him do the right thing, right contribution in the first go, that itself is very difficult. Because he has to understand a lot of domain knowledge, right? There are contracts, but that they are at a very high level. So you don't have smaller components, you don't have a lot of documentation. And the second problem being as you scale. So there are certain parts of this monolith which kind of gets most number of hits. So then again, it's not economically efficient to scale the whole monolith, right? So you want to only scale specific systems which are going to get most number of requests per minute, let's say. So then we started going into microservices. So the whole journey there, I think what has worked out really well for us is you clearly identify the business domains that you have. Example being, so us is a social commerce market, right? So the tech stack looks very similar to e-commerce marketplace. So you have logistics as a domain, you have demand as a domain, you have supply as a domain, you have demand supply matching. So just think about it in terms of business domains. And then try to segregate responsibilities for each of these domains, try to define a contract between them, and just be comfortable with your next service getting broken down into further smaller services as you scale up. Because again, you don't want to overdo your engineering, right? The focus should always be on iterating quickly, building for your users, going to market very quickly. So then now that we have around 80 people, 80 members strong tech team, I think almost 80% of our system is now running on microservices architecture. Gradually, we have now kind of automated a lot of things, deployments, Dockerization, continuous integrations. But yes, the crux being tech should just be viewed as a tool. There is no right answer which fits everyone. It depends on where you are starting and what is your need.
That's a perfect way again to look at it. It's all about pivoting. When do you need to pivot? When you are developing, it's not necessary that you need to start with A and reach B. I mean, you can always start at some other point. And as you are able to really correct yourself and meet the needs, I think that's what is a great thing. You know, while you all develop this, I think one of the big thing always concerning today in this architecture, whatever we are developing, whether it is monolith or microservices, one of the challenge I see, if I think about you, Paddy, your platform has provided a lot of power to so many automobiles in terms of their safety, in terms of their connectivity, entertainment, and you say it, and every aspect is covered. And as you speak, every moment there are millions of people having very high kinetic energy, right? People who are driving the cars having so much high kinetic energy, and your platform in a way keeps them safe. And in today's world where there is so much of cyber attacks happening, whether it is in healthcare or anywhere, people taking you for ransom is a norm of the day. Very recently, there was one city corporation in US paid a ransom of 700K to just release all their computers. So how do you look at this, and how do you really keep yourself safe continuously? And I think, this question will be to both of you also. But I think I want to start with Paddy. This is a very interesting and safety-related thing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So security, both in terms of data security and in terms of platform security, right? So there was a news about a very large hotel chain that, recently managed to leak user data, right? Without going into specifics. And there was, of course, a lot of analysis done about what led to the leakage. And how did such a secure perimeter, right, of servers and data manage to leak about 600, 700,000 user data, right, including their card information and, demography, et cetera, et cetera. Being privy to some of the backend analysis, essentially it was about, scaling your services without an afterthought about what level of security and encryption you are implementing between the network calls that the services make. One disadvantage that microservices bring with it, which is a very big disadvantage, which is the administration nightmare and a design nightmare, is that it's heavily networked. So there's a lot of data that's flowing on the wire between various services, right? If it's a monolith, you have a 3-tier architecture, you secure the perimeter, you encrypt at the database level, you probably encrypt calls, HTTPS calls and web service calls, and you're kind of more or less sorted, right? At least you can be confident that your data is not leaked, but for real attacks, penetration attacks from wherever it's possible. But in microservices, the leakage zones are simply too many, right? Just because of the network calls that these services tend to make. So one of the things that we do consciously, Dileep, is we don't over-engineer it, and he mentioned it quite nicely that if you give it to architects, right, they can fill up 10 boards of services and still not be happy about what they filled up on the board, right? And still granularize it and say I'll make calls and et cetera, et cetera. So somewhere we got to abstract it and say, hey, what is the administrative overhead we are taking over here? What are the leakage zones we are creating? What are the vulnerability areas that we are creating sheerly from a network call standpoint? And how much can we encrypt, right? There is a limit to what you can track as traffic and track as encryption. So prudent design, right, from a scalability standpoint, also from a security standpoint is extremely important. So we have certain design guidelines that we follow in terms of not over-engineering it, in terms of not creating a service because somebody fancied it, in terms of not just calling out a service not fitting into the entire scheme of things itself, and most importantly, hardening the service. So we have a 5.1 layer hardening that we perform all the way from silicon to application to OS to et cetera, et cetera. That's our proprietary hardening mechanism that we have developed over a period of time. Because as you rightly mentioned, our platform manages anywhere between 5 million to 10 million moving parts on a given day. And these are high kinetic energy parts, right? With unpredictable human beings behind the steering, right? So, and if they are humans in Bangalore, you never know what's going to happen, right? The car may still be running, but human may not be present inside. It might have gotten out of the car. So, so it's very, very important that we build frameworks and ruggedize and harden every piece of code that goes into production. But what happens also is when we do this, and that's a learning that we've had. So when we we had issues, we corrected it, and we over-corrected it. And what we figured out was that daily releases and weekly releases are becoming monthly releases again, right? And there was this whole security organization sitting on top of developers, saying, hey, unless I stamp it, nothing goes on. And that becomes like a protocol or a layer of release, right? And that adds up to your timeline. And then your business comes back and sits on your head saying, you know what, good for nothing. You might as well have an insecure code as against not having code at all because my revenue is dropping, right? So it's a very interesting conflict that we see in some of the conference rooms, except that we don't hit each other, but everything else happens in those meetings. But the key aspect here is don't over-engineer. Have your data flow in mind, and please remember that you can't encrypt the hell out of data. There is always vulnerability in your data at whatever level you keep it. And most important is if you are storing customer data like these two gentlemen do, then obviously, it goes without saying, right? That, very, very, very cautious design is all that it takes, yeah.
So Shashank, I will twist the question a bit, because he brought a very interesting point. Company like his or mine, we have some big guy sitting there and saying, thou shall not release till I put my stamp. What about your company? You don't have thou shall not guy. So how do you secure the data?
Yeah, I mean, so usually I think in our case, one of the founders dons that role. Typically the CTO, right? Who is like, business is business, but security, right? So, but anyway, jokes apart, I think how for us again, as I said, right, with startups, trade-offs is almost always going to be there. But we as a company realized very early on that the space we're in, the proposition we're trying to build, and so on and so forth, involves so much sensitivity across both spectrums: the professional, the kind of work that they're doing, their incomes, etc., as well as businesses and the objectives that they are running on our platform, and what they're leveraging the professionals for. So we were very cognizant from day one that any thing going wrong here could be very catastrophic, right? So I think how we viewed this was, we again try to wonder, uh, took two approaches largely. One was that of prioritization, that is, don't touch things which you cannot take on today, right? Rely on some standard services in order to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to maintaining that, along with what Sanjeev very rightly mentioned. You're iterating at a point, you're trying to solve a unknown problem uh, for which solutions could be many. So in that mindset, taking on these overheads could become very cumbersome. So for instance, we our a lot of our deployment, etc., happens on Heroku, which is built on top of AWS. So for a long time, we've not had to wonder or spend too much effort on DevOps per se, as of today. I'm sure it'll change in the future, but today that's invaluable for us as a team with limited resources, because then you can get to focus on the things that you want to do, right? You want to iterate, you want to improve the experience of the user. That's one aspect from a prioritization standpoint. I think the second aspect, which is in a minuscule manner what we kind of, but have a very similar school of thought as Paddy sir mentioned, is that what is a cultural aspect within each engineer and developer, right? Why is certain thing important? Why does multiple checks have to be put in place if you're writing to the DB, or you're taking off some access, and so on and so forth. And also a culture of, especially because we have a lot of young developers, right? Freshers just out of college, working for the first time with a lot of these systems, with a group of developers. So then code reviews, those mentoring, one-on-ones, a lot of these become very crucial at our stage in order to ensure that these things are intact and doesn't result in unforeseen circumstances.
Okay, great. Sanjeev, I think quickly on the same topic, I think your challenge is a little bit more in terms of you do a lot of transaction, financial especially, and with demonetization happening, with so much of scrutiny on the financial transactions. I think you are at a what do you call as visibility of the government in terms of how is this being done, and how do you manage this piece of security. I still call it a security because financially this is a challenging thing. How do you manage that in terms of validating who is transacting, how is it being, how your platform is not being used for wrong means?
Yeah, sure. So it's not on. Oh, yeah. So basically, Meesho is extremely data-driven organization. So this challenge becomes even more complex for us because um, almost every team has access to a lot of data. So they build their own dashboards on top of it, track different metrics, including a lot of analysis on the financial side as well. So there are multiple ways in how we tackle this. So first and foremost being you need to have a very good centralized access control. You need to make sure the principle of least privilege is always followed. You only expose only that amount of data which is required to kind of make him enable him to make the right decision. But yeah, so coming to the financial side of it, so I think there's a simple way of solving it. How we did it is kind of encrypting all of that and doing analysis on the encryption side. So basically, if you just do a simple, and obviously I'm not going to tell you which algorithm we use, but just an example, if you just do a MD5 of your bank account numbers and you just analyze and you just expose that to your analysts, there is no risk of data leakage. But then you have to ensure this transformation is happening in the right way and there are right gatekeepers in this whole data pipeline. So we try to kind of leverage these algorithms to ensure data is sufficiently kind of hashed, and it is very difficult to kind of get back to the original number. But yes.
Great. Look, I think this is a fantastic conversation. If I want to go for another hour with this team. This is so insightful. You know, in short, if I can think about it, these microservice architecture definitely make sure that our ability to correct quickly for any features or additions or corrections, developing patches, it develops a very efficient solution. By doing so, it also provides a hugely economical way of developing your platforms. Is that the only answer to all your platform requiremends? Probably not. There are cases like what they both talked about. You start with monolithic and end with microservice, and you may end with back-end monolithic and front-end microservices. So there are many ways you can do it. There's no one perfect answer. But this, to me, is going to be something for the future where the connectivity is going to drive a lot more integration between different devices, different services, different platforms. This is going to be the norm of the day. And in that case, we need to create these APIs for other people to come and utilize our platform to create solutions which are going to be impactful for human beings. So with that, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open it up for audience. If you have any questions, one or two questions we can take. How much time do we have for questions? About 5 minutes? So 2 minutes. So any questions? You know, this is a test for all of you that you did not go to sleep after lunch.
Foresee that. Okay, your business demand. Okay, you should forecast that. That is where you build your workforce to work on that. So how do you solve that problem? See, business can come anytime. Okay, in the market they have peers, how they're competing, but ultimately there should not be a gap when that demand comes. Okay, your workforce should be ready to execute that.
Okay, so was it a question or a...
No, what I'm saying is, how do you solve that? So basically, okay, business can come anytime. Okay, this is what the industry is driving.
Okay, you are asking how you solve that.
Yeah. So basically, how do you make sure that your workforce is also ready with that?
Okay. Do I get prizes to answer the question or? No, just for a joke. So, you know, everybody is trying to figure out their own way to bridge that gap. Our CTO organization is extremely active in that area. So we have what is called as a look ahead technology lighthouse. So this team continuously keeps bringing in newer technologies, newer way of implementing things, newer DevOps tools or newer CI/CD tools or newer immutable infrastructure tools, etc., etc. So there is a tooling innovation team that keeps constantly researching on what's relevant to our domain, right? For example, we have research running on speech recognition, right? Alexas and Googles of the world are doing, because we see a phenomenal captive market in the automobile space, which is where our strength is, where speech recognition is going to be the big order of the day, right, in terms of talking to your car. So we have a team running that research, and not only research from a technology standpoint, but also from its relevance to what we are doing as a business standpoint. So the CTO council, continues to meet with the business, and there is a healthy debate that happens between both as to what are the ideas ahead of its time, what are the ideas that has passed its time, and business likewise comes back saying, hey, we missed the bus in this, competition has caught up. So this kind of happens every fortnight, every month. So there are vehicles and instruments that keep doing that. But you know what? These are all company-wide vehicles, right? And these keep operating the way it operates in various organizations. I'm sure various companies have their own vehicles. But nothing can replace a technologist who is domain aware and wake up at the time and say, raise his hands and say, I have this technology, I know this application is relevant to this business, I want to build this and show it to your business. So we encourage open innovation. We encourage all possible people in our company to participate in open innovation. We encourage them to provide us ideas, and we incentivize them when an idea becomes a hit in the market. So, and to Dileep's point, as you become bigger, it's easier to get lost. So we have at least till now managed to keep up the startup culture, which these two gentlemen are already having. to get our teams to be participative in the growth of the organization. So that's more important. So unless the grassroots level technologies wakes up and says, I have an idea which I feel is relevant for you and will make you a winner in the market, all these councils are just meetings with, tea, coffee, and biscuits. That's pretty much it.
Great. Hey, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think, we have actually taken a little bit more time. But just to close it, if you want to continue to have some more discussion, you can have a chai pe charcha outside. And I think last point, what Paddy mentioned is very nice. As as we grow older, we want to become younger. As we become bigger company, we want to become a startup company. And we have a lot to learn from both of you. And thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
For a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question.